So now we're recording for today's live lecture on books 1 through 3 of the Republic. Um, I will sort of pace myself through the lecture. For those of you who are attending live, if you have a question at any point, you can stop me. I am hoping that this will be about a little less than an hour because I have a 4 o'clock appointment. So I won't keep you too long, but it is a lot of material to go through. And the way that I have decided to go through it is I have sort of like an outline I'm just going to walk us through. I think that I want to start off with a little bit of reflection on Plato's life. So Plato, there's jokes, right, that Plato is sort of the bedrock of all of Western political thought, and that everything else is just a footnote. And that's an exaggeration. But on the other hand, I think when you read the Republic, you'll sort of understand why people say that. And the reason they say that is because you see questions raised here that are going to sort of be the standard questions or versions of the standard questions that will be the ones you see for basically the rest of the time in Western political philosophy. He was an elite Athenian. So he was sort of the height of nobility, of what manhood was supposed to be at that time. He was a gentleman. He grew up during part of the Peloponnesian War, but he was really attracted to Socrates' style of philosophy. And so in that sort of attraction, you see the kind of tension that got Socrates killed, right? Which is that the elites of the city are losing their sons to this, stonecutter philosopher who like wanders the streets. So he was destabilizing the political order in more ways than one. And Plato is living proof of that. He is influenced by Socrates in profound ways, but he's also going to be influenced in a way that you'll see in the Republic with democracy. And he sees democracy as what killed basically the most important person in his life. And that it was philosophy itself that had threatened the city, and then the city killed the philosopher. Now, he's actually, when we get to the regime stages at the end of the book, he is a bit harsh about democracy, but he also calls it the only other regime besides the best regime that philosophy can be done in. So I think that's notable. So the basic conclusion that he comes from his experiences in life, starting with, watching what Socrates went through, he himself tried to teach a king how to rule, and he failed at that. And he had some experience with the strife of the 30 tyrants. His opinion of politics is very low in a way. So existing cities are corrupt, and genuine political reform comes from the outside. The source is too corrupt to be the source of renewal. You need philosophy to come in and redo everything. And offer basically what I think the best way of understanding the Republic is: offer a paideia, offer an education, an opinion that renews sort of the sources of judgment that the citizens will have. The Republic of Plato is the name of the text, and It's called in Greek politeia, which translates into republic, but can also mean regime and even opinion. And so I think the most fitting for interpretive purposes title is actually opinion. He wants to know what are the sort of beliefs that citizens must have. And you're going to see he thinks that these beliefs are approximating what is true, right? So they're not just lies. What kinds of beliefs do you have to have a healthy political culture that avoids the problem of injustice? So this is a focusing on education, broadly speaking, not in the way we talk about, right? So we talk about education like we're going to get a degree. Education in the sense of paideia, which is going to be a part of the opinion of the city, is not like that. What it's like is it's like, you might say, the mores, the sources of judgment, the water that you swim in, basically. And so there's not, if this is the case, if that's what education is, in the Republic, there is no difference between public and private in the modern sense. So, in the modern sense, we think about ourselves as having rights. Most of the time, most of us think this, that sort of pre-exists the community, political community, and that when we enter into community, we still have these rights and they have to be recognized. There's not really that sort of disjunction between the public and private for them. You find sort of your person and your formation in the community. And also, there's not a difference between, I guess you might say, public morality and private morality. And that's why, as we keep going, I'm trying to set us up. You're going to see that's why we have the city and the soul, right? And they are going to eventually be metaphors for each other. The only way the city and soul can be metaphors for each other is if there is not public morality and private morality. So I think that the next place I want to go is to talking about the method. You have had some experience now reading Plato, and I'm really open to sort of hearing what you guys need to hear more about. But Plato is someone who writes in dialogues, and he is going to use this style to make you reflect. So what you're going to see happening is, my best advice is to think of it as a literal play, that you're watching a story unfold, and as the plot changes, your opinions about the topics of the play and the characters in the play are going to change too. So he's trying to do this, but with political philosophy. So it's a way of trying to get the reader to be involved in like an actual conversation with themselves, basically, where the text is provoking you. This means that you're going to see him redefine things a lot of times, or you're going to see back and forth happen. And you're going to be like, wait, I thought we just ruled that out. Or wait, this definition doesn't match the definition from earlier. And I just want you to know that that's okay. And actually studying the way that things change will help you get more of a sense of what is happening. Another hint as we're going through this is to be sure that you pay attention to who speaks. So Polemarchus is going to have a very different character than Glaucon, and Socrates has a different character than all of them. Thrasymachus has a character. It's like a play in that sense. You can expect the characters to match with basically the plot. So I think that that's probably enough setup. The dialogue starts, as you saw, at the Piraeus, which is a port near Athens, and it's going to rebel against a tyrant 7 years after the dramatic setting of the play. So the dialogue set at a certain time, the readers would know, oh, this is taking place in the Piraeus 7 years before they had their resistance. So all the people that are there, it's a very conscious setting where you're talking about, you're opening a story where the question is, what is justice, in a place where there's this massive civil war 7 years later. And the men involved in the dialogue are politically important. So Cephalus's family was really involved in the rebellion, and Polemarchus actually dies in the rebellion. And I think that that's important because it's sort of letting you into the work that Plato's Socrates is doing. You can see this text, you can read this text and think, this is too abstract. The setting that it's taking place in is actually not very abstract. It would be very real to the people who were reading it at the time and have huge significance. So he's trying to make these big abstract ideas take place in, you know, a discussion that's happening in like, what if there was a philosophical discussion in a dialogue we read like 5 years from now that took place on the Capitol on January 6th of 2021. That would be the sort of thing that's happening here. And I think that the temptation when you're reading Plato, and a lot of this you can see is just me kind of like trying to pump you up for being able to interpret him as we go on. The temptation is when you're reading Plato to think that he is literal. I can't emphasize enough again, when you're reading him, read him like he is writing a play. Read it like it is poetry or fiction. Look for foreshadowing, look for tension. This would be very different from when you read Aristotle, okay? And so if he says things that contradict themselves or that don't seem to make sense, or if there's a turn of plot that seems puzzling to you, you need to stop and ask yourself what's going on. So for the next parts of the lecture, what I'm going to try to do is imitate that kind of interaction with the text as I walk us through significant parts of the first 3 books. The basic question in the Republic is, what is justice? Every single Platonic dialogue has a question, like what is piety? What is beauty? What is justice is this one. And that's probably part of why it's so foundational to political theory. Socrates' first definition of justice comes from Cephalus. And Cephalus is this older man who is very wealthy. He's done really well for himself. And he also is well born. He's lived his life and he's basically retired. And Socrates is asking him, you know, as an old man, someone who's had this great life and's at the end of it, what's the greatest good that you got from being wealthy? And his answer is not having to cheat or deceive, right? Being able to pay what you owe. This becomes the first definition of justice, speaking the truth and paying one's debts. Okay, so what is the problem with this definition? Because now you're starting to see the style. The definition is there. It's coming from this older, wealthy man. And we're going to see what Socrates does with it. Well, parts of this are obviously true. We shouldn't lie. We should pay back what we owe. This is just distributive justice at its most basic level. But let's go on a detour for a bit, and it'll help us. So I'm waiting for a call for a doctor. That's why my phone's on. I just want you guys to know. I'm not trying to be disrespectful if you hear my beeping over here. So Cephalus is saying that in his old age, justice is clear to him. Because as we age, the pleasures of the body die. And he says when he was young, he felt like he was driven by what he called mad slave drivers. His passions wouldn't let him stop and think, should I do X or should I do Y? And he says other old men miss the kinds of things they could do when they were younger. But I don't, because I can think. And he's going to think that this means that he's become a good person. That is connected to his definition of justice. So let me explain why. If you think about his definition, it seems that in order to be just, you'd have to be wealthy. But there's no connection between wealth and justice, meaning that, you know, someone who has money, it does not automatically mean that they're just. If someone lacks money, it doesn't mean they're unjust. So that's an incoherent standard. And character, like having the character of justice and old age, is also incoherent, because it's not, you're not making a choice anymore. You don't want things that are bad for you anymore. And so you have a good character when it's not like you could have chosen otherwise. So what you'll see is that it's extremely limited to basically the limited opinion, the limited vision of Cephalus. And you're sort of finding as you talk to him that, you know, one of the things that he might like about old age is the fact that he made his money probably by doing things that were unjust, right? So he ends his conversation with Socrates by taking off to go make sacrifices to the gods. And he does this all the time now that he's old, now that he's made his money, now that he's done what he's wanted. He's basically living his old age by repaying the gods with his money. This is sort of the massive deformation of this definition. Who is just? The old guy who made money by tricking people, and now at the end of his life gets to pay for lots of sacrifices to the gods, who will then forgive him for all the bad stuff he did. But if he was poor and he did that bad stuff, he would not be forgiven. And what would that mean? That would mean that the gods were not just. The question of whether or not the gods are just is one that recurs over and over and over again in the Republic, and you need to hold on to that. So I think that's enough with that definition. But basically you're starting to see, I think, the kinds of things that you can bring out of the text. Like I said, though, it's partly true. So as we continue in the dialogue, you will find that he says, you know, things, he repeats parts of the definition, Socrates does. The second definition comes from Polemarchus. And basically what you have here is, after a discussion of giving to each what is owed, you have the example of the harmful crazy man, like who is owed what? Well, your friend is drinking and they want to drive their car. And you say no. Technically, that's a violation of their property rights. But what Socrates points out is that actually that's the just choice to make. So sometimes when we're talking about what justice is, you can't strictly go by what is technically owed. There has to be some amount of reflection and prudence involved. So for Polemarchus, if we can't answer the question of what is owed so easily, then what we have is giving benefits and harms to friends and enemies. That's the next stage of this definition. In war, you know, you would practice a certain law, and in peace, you keep contracts. The character of Odysseus comes up here as being one who would fit into this sort of rubric of thinking about justice. So it's just to help the just, it's just to harm the unjust. Polemarchus is very spirited. He is the one who dies in the rebellion. ultimately, the second definition of justice that comes from him is to treat friends well and enemies badly. This has a lot of problems. One of them is that you might be able to treat people well in things that pertain not at all to justice. Like if you're a navigator and you navigate a ship well, you treated your passengers well, but you wouldn't be talking about justice in this moral sense that Polemarch is trying to get at. But more importantly, the ultimate problem is that Socrates makes a really radical argument here, which is that a just man will never harm anyone. The just man won't ever do the unjust deed. Harming people on this theory makes them worse. You become worse by committing harm to another. So if you are just, you would not do this. This makes this definition impossible, though you'll see it return again in the form of loyalty in the Scythian speech. The third definition is where things really start to take off. So you have here Thrasymachus. And Thrasymachus, they say he's sitting there looking like a vulture, right? So he comes in kind of wild. He tells Socrates basically he's full of crap. And he makes fun of him and he accuses him of being a sophist. What he comes in to do is he really raises the stakes. So we have two definitions of justice that are incomplete and that have kind of revealed to us problems. One is basically the capacities problem. Like in order to be good, what capacities do you have to have? Well, for Plato, it seems that he's going to be more interior about this, right, than Aristotle, which we'll get, just hold on to that. We'll get to that as the course goes on. And then the second problem is the friends and enemies distinction. And basically what Plato says is that friends and enemies are such a thing. There is such a thing as friends and enemies, but you can't treat enemies poorly if you want to be just. So now Thrasymachus is going to sort of explode these things by saying justice is not good. He's going to say that justice is, this is complicated. Injustice is what we think of as justice. Injustice is what we think of as good. Doing injustice is what the virtuous or smart man would choose to do. Because in the end, there is no justice. Justice is circumstantial. It's the advantage of the stronger. That is all it is. It's just the advantage of the stronger. Who is the strong? It's those who hold power in the city, who are the sovereign. And that could be anybody based on whatever regime form you're in. If you're tyranny, it's a tyrant. Oligarchy, it's the oligarchs. If it's a democratic mob, it's the masses. So the content there is going to shift, but the way that you can tell that it's and it's what's happening on Thrasymachus' account and later on Socrates' account is that the ones who have the strength and the power always define justice in a way that is in their self-interest, with no eye toward anybody else. So if you have a ruler who makes a mistake about what his advantage is, then maybe Thrasymachus' definition doesn't work. This is the first objection Socrates tries to mount. And then he says, well, look, there's no advantage to an art but to be as perfect as possible. So the good of medicine is for the body. The good of rule is for the ruled. The good of rule is not for the ruler. Here, Thrasymachus stops Socrates and says, have you ever heard about the sheep who are taken care of by their shepherd and then devoured? Basically, the idea that rule can be for the good of the ruler and not the ruled. And Thrasymachus continues to elaborate. The ruler makes the laws to benefit himself. The just man doesn't fare well. In fact, they fare very poorly. It's the unjust man who is the most profitable. And believing otherwise would be really naive. If this is all true, then the tyrant is the happiest of men. This is where the main problematic gets set up for the book. Because the question he's going to have to answer is whether or not being unjust is what makes you happy. Because if it is, then you should be unjust in your time on earth. And it leads to a second question, which is that whatever the structure of the universe is, and for Plato, he's he's dealing with what is called natural theology. So it's philosophical, sort of monotheistic, metaphysical reflections on God, right? So for Plato, there's a God who is basically the source of all being, and we'll come into this later. But and he makes the whole that we inhabit. And we're just a small part of that whole. But if it's true that injustice is how the human flourishes, then what that means is that the God, the one God, because he's unusual in the sense for an ancient, is not just. Okay. So this is part of the problem that I was talking to you about. We take a little break here after sort of what is this big moment where Thrasymachus basically just says, you know, the belief in the good and the desire to live well are stupid. And there is no such thing as law and justice and order. And you have to remember that this is taking place, right, in front of these young men who are nobility. And so this sort of goes off like a bomb. Socrates is not really able to answer. He makes the objections I told you, but he doesn't get into much more detail. He kind of seems kind of weak. At this point, he introduces an argument that becomes important for the rest of the text. And it seems like a digression. So this is another moment where you guys should think what you should ask yourself what you think about how to read this text. So what is the function of the eye? It's to see. What is the function of the ear? It's to hear. What is the function of the pruning knife? It's to cut. The function is what a thing alone can do, or what it does better than anything else. And you want something that does that thing that it's supposed to do well. So I want a knife that is sharp. Virtue of the knife, the arete of the knife, is sharpness. It's a really simple argument, but it's going to become really important. Things have a proper work, something they're supposed to do, and then they have a corresponding excellence that makes them function well. What is the function of the soul? This is structurally foundational for the rest of what we're doing. The function of the soul is ruling, deliberating, and living. And an important question for the rest of the dialogue is, what is the virtue of the soul? Virtue of the soul will turn out to be justice, but it's going to take us a while to get there. After that digression, which actually becomes hugely important later, we move on to more action, sort of get back to the plot, which is Glaucon and Adeimantus wanting a rejoinder to Thrasymachus. They're like, Thrasymachus has basically disillusioned us. We want to know from you, Socrates, why you think justice is good. And here Glaucon gives 3 categories of goodness. And the first category is things that are good for their own sake, but nothing beyond. So a harmless pleasure, like, you know, I used to eat flaming hot Cheetos. That would be a harmless pleasure, but there's no content there. Things that are harmful at the moment, but have positive long-term effects, like You have to go to the dentist. Nobody likes going to the dentist, but you would say, yeah, this is positive for me overall. Things that are good for their sake, but also for what comes from them. So combining these two goods, features of the good for your own sake, good for your benefit, that is the highest form of good. And an example of that would be health. Health is something we enjoy, it feels good, but health is also something that is useful. Knowledge is an example he gives here. That's one that I think always sounds weird to students, maybe, but think about something that you've been really excited to learn about, that you care about at any point. Even something weird, like, remember when I was little, I was obsessed with aliens, right? So then if I learned something new about aliens, I'd be really excited. Okay, that kind of pure like excitement at knowledge, in addition to the content of knowledge, this is one of the highest forms of the good. What Glaucon and Adeimantus want is for justice to be in that highest form of the good. Glaucon says that justice is probably like medicine. If Thrasymachus is wrong, justice is at best unpleasant, but with good effects. So this is his argument for justice. If we pursue one's interests, and harming others comes naturally to human beings, right? Because you're pursuing your self-interest and then you harm each other. Then it's only the law, which is the representative of justice, which causes people to do otherwise. Okay, law then is a custom that goes against our true nature and basically keeps us from treating each other as poorly as we could. This is a really modern kind of take on law. Now, they want to hear the case for justice. If dangers of being unharmed outweigh benefits of harming others, we'll all agree not to harm each other. And that sounds like modern political thought. But where do they take this? They say, well, this means that in reality, the best life would be to do injustice and just never get caught, right? If what we want to do is to be able to have our self-interest and have it unimpeded, and then we don't do that because of the law, well, the best life is being able to do that and just never have to pay the price. And the worst life would be to be punished by the law without ever having done anything that you wanted to do, really. On this account, then, justice is only valued because people are too weak to do injustice. And if they could, what they would want to do would be to be unjust. So they want to know, they're basically giving all their deepest fears to Socrates. They want to know why these sort of questions they have about justice aren't true. There's a famous, passage here you guys are probably familiar with, where they do the thought experiment of the ring of Gyges. And you have someone who goes invisible when they put on a ring. A just man and an unjust man on this theory will behave the exact same way. The man kills the king. He seduces the king's wife before he does that. And he becomes a tyrant. And they say everybody would do this if they could. Another way they say to put the problem is to allow someone who is the most unjust to get the most praise for justice, and let the one who is most just, get no praise for justice, and in fact be tortured on the rack as the most terrible person. So they're doing thought experiments to basically say justice has no value in itself. Okay, it has a value when you are too weak to do otherwise. And it has a value if other people recognize you as just, but you don't have to be really just to get the recognition of justice. Reputation for justice is more important than justice itself. In the end, they suggest, again, and here we're back to the gods, if you look at Odysseus, his skills always get him by. The question of justice or injustice doesn't really matter when it comes to Odysseus in some sense and how the gods treat him. The gods might not really care in the end, if they even exist, and they can be appeased by sacrifices. So this is kind of the whole word vomit of Glaucon and Adeimantus. And those are a lot of objections that I just went over to the idea that there is some sort of whole, integrated, standardized concept of justice. I just want to make that clear before I pause and move on. That is the sort of next pivot moment. This is the list of orders that Socrates is going to have to meet. So for the rest of the book, what you're going to have is this experience of trying to answer these points and coming back to them. And you're going to have it through the city-soul analogy. Why do we have a city-soul analogy? When you think about it, the reason he gives is that it's because there's a small lettering and big lettering. And you can always see the words better with big lettering. So a city is big and a soul is small, okay? And a city is made up of a lot of humans. That might be one way to look at it, and it's probably the easiest reading of the text. I'm going to eat a little bit so I don't get nauseous because I have these kidney stones. It's a little deeper than that, though. What is the function of the city? To rule, manage, and deliberate. What is the function of the soul? To rule, manage, and deliberate. The soul and the city have the same function, which means that they have the same virtue. And that virtue is justice. So by focusing on one of them, you're actually learning about the other at the same time. The City and Speech then is where we're sort of taking off from now on. He's going to be constructing this step by step. And it's a story that is of progress. Not progress like things get better. It's a developmental story. So they start off with the City of Pigs. In the City of Pigs, no one is self-sufficient. We need lots of things and we can't provide them for ourselves. And we exchange with each other, we complement each other, we realize naturally that we need each other. We come into partnership. We come in as well with a division of labor because we have a different skill, if it's a different specialization, we exchange. The city is organized to provide for basic needs from the start: food, shelter, clothes. And the focus is on bodily needs and desires. There's a passage where it says they recline, they converse, they eat simple foods like nuts and leaves. They play, they have sex. It sounds like a good life. I mean, I've got 2 kids and a job and I'm exhausted. And sometimes I read about the City of Pigs and I think that sounds perfect. But what is missing? Well, Glaucon changes the pattern again, that the way that we're going again. He says, I can't believe they'd eat those foods. Like, and the foods are like grapes and nuts and whatever. And he says, what about the relishes? And relishes are like salsa or, chutney, or just the things that take the food to that extra level. He can't imagine why any humans would want to live without relishes. That sounds really stupid, but relishes symbolize pleasantries and luxuries, the pleasing, the beautiful, okay? So the City of Pigs is a city of necessity, but there are parts of us that are seeking higher pleasures or more complex pleasures, more complex beauty, and those still have longings. So an analog might be to the relishes art. I long for art. I long for great deeds. I long for complex conversations about philosophy. I long for music, maybe a kind of music that could only be made with an orchestra, that could only be made in a society that, you know, had leisure. What you get out of this is the feverish city, which is the city where people have more than they need and they're driven by their desires. So they have luxuries, art, music. They're very materialistic. They consume everything. It's the feverish city, so it doesn't feel good. But you also have more high pleasures. So basically here, what you've got is a situation where you have risk and reward. You get these highs of human achievement and human satisfaction in the feverish city that you don't get in the city of pigs. On the other hand, you pay these really high costs. One of those costs is materialism and consumption that basically destroy the city and make them have to go to conquer other cities so they can consume more. They consume so much that they have to go to war. This is another turning point. This is the end of the feverish city. They make warfare a profession. This is the first time you see the entrance of the guardian class. The name guardian is going to persist. At this stage, guardian just means soldier. Okay, so basically the city has to have standing soldiers to keep going to war because they are becoming like an empire and they need to keep getting resources. You have a division in the city now between two classes. The producers, the people who earn a wage or are craftsmen or farmers, and the guardians. The producers' motivations are understood to be bodily desires. You know, we just want to get our paycheck. And the guardian motivation, according to Plato, is going to be spiritedness. And spiritedness is something that, as we keep talking in the course for the Republic, will continue to arise. Spiritedness is sort of that part of the human that rises up at something that provokes them. So like if someone called your mother a bad name, that the spirited part of you would be aroused to say that's unjust. But a spirited part of you can be aroused for bad reasons too. Spiritedness is neither good nor bad in itself, but what it is it's useful in a soldier. And the danger of the fact that it's neither good nor bad in itself is that you have these spirited guardians over the producers. They might treat the citizens harshly. There's nothing about that sort of quickness to defend oneself and one's honor that necessarily means you'll treat other people well. What has to happen is they have to identify the citizens as something that they will protect. They have to have a combination of spiritedness and gentleness. And here you see the return of Polemarchus's definition. They have to know who their friends are and who their enemies are, which means that they have to have an education in what to fear, specifically in what to fear. Human motivation is not irrational. So you're not, for Plato, you're not like Hobbes or Locke, who is going to have this sort of direct line between desire and reason. Plato's going to think you can have your desire shaped, basically, so that if the guardians are educated in the right way, they will not have the desire to attack their own people. And that's why education is so important. Education is what gives them the taste for justice. And remember, education isn't like how we mean it, but education basically means the whole, everything. What you eat, what you wear, what you see as art, what you talk about, everything that basically forms you as an individual. So the guardian class is the focus of Plato's educational system. We tend to think about education as something instrumental. He thinks education is essential to virtue and that virtue is essential for happiness. This is something that I think is hard to get your head around. At least it was for me. So this part is book 3, and I'm going to go through it with you only lightly because I think the particulars of it are less important than the theme or the philosophical point. So in this part of the book, you hear all kinds of weird things about how they walk, how they'll sleep, what they will wear, what they won't wear, what they won't eat. And it seems like a lot of censorship. One of the important things you find out is that, you can't really have these stories of the gods, returning to the question of whether the gods are just or not. You can't have these stories of the gods where like Zeus is raping his sister. Well, what does that mean about the gods? And then what does that mean about justice? And then if these soldiers know that, then they're just going to go rape all the people, right? So this is like quite literally what he's thinking when he's thinking about the gods and justice. And it comes out in this forum of education. But what you'll see is that this is actually kind of conditioning. It's a conditioning for taste. And this is because I suspect that for the Greeks, justice is a matter of taste, not that it's subjective. Let me try to explain. So when I was in college, this is a weird example. When I was in college, I had to take a class on opera for credit, and I didn't really want to. And I was kind of scared too, because it seemed like a hard class. It was on the history of opera. The teacher was really intense. I didn't like opera. I thought it sounded terrible. After about the first 4 weeks of class, I was totally in love with opera. And I had changed so much that I would listen to it when I would work out or when I was in my car. And what happened is I understood it. From her class, I learned to appreciate its beauty, but I learned the specifics of that tradition and what to look for and what different voices meant and what different kinds of music at different times meant and what different characters meant, in a way that everything had significance and meaning for me. And once I learned and I keyed into those significance and meanings, and then I could see their differences between each other and stuff, I loved the music. I think Socrates thinks justice works like that. That when you can begin to understand and experience at the same time what justice really is, you will find pleasure in it. It's not just book learning, it's experiential learning and formation. It's almost like that Christian concept of tasting and seeing. Okay, you have to experience to be able to understand. You can't just say to someone, this is what justice is. You have to form them in their reactions to the just and the unjust. And that's going to mean that justice, in a way, is something that we can only recognize, maybe, this is the possibility raised in the Republic, under the right conditions. So it's not that it doesn't exist. It's that in order to know it, you have to have been able to receive it. And some of us on Plato's account are not able to receive it. In this part of the book, he talks about how if someone is too old and too habituated in their ways and their opinions, they're not going to be able to become a part of the just city. They're beyond having their taste shaped. Okay, this is a possibility he raises. Remember, not everything is literal. But the implication here is that if justice is real, but we have to be able to receive justice, what happens when we have these corrupt experiences of life? What happens when our paideia, our education, is one that teaches us to want the wrong things or to value the wrong things? Like, think about Glaucon and Adeimantus. One of the things they keep bringing up in their objections, and their objections are good, right? But one of the things they keep bringing up in their objections is Odysseus. Well, Odysseus, they would have known all about Odysseus. They would have been raised on those stories as little boys. So now that they're growing up, what do they think is the best thing to be, the best thing to do? Who is their sort of hero? It's Odysseus. But you're running into this problem then, because what justice is starting to look like in its contours is not what Odysseus looks like. But if you have someone who really loves Odysseus and has been formed by that, are they going to be able to recognize what justice is? If you have someone who sort of delights in the stories of the gods being capricious or raping people, then maybe you're not going to ever be able to really tap into what justice is. And as we keep going, what you're going to see is that justice is going to be a kind of balance. This is different than, like, if we were, I'd like to use the comparison to the moderns, because if you're reading Locke or Hobbes, it's going to be very clear. You could probably even define it in just a sentence. What happens with the Republic's definition of justice is that it becomes about order and balance, which is complicated because then it's about a combination of parts. And those parts have to work together. Let me just look at my notes one more time to make sure. One thing I wanted to point out is that he says here that music is sort of the quickest way to form the soul. He says that our soul is, and here soul is just a metaphysical thing. He's not using it in a religious sense, though he does think the soul is eternal. The soul is most malleable when we're children, right? And our character is developed in childhood. So it might be impossible to recover certain parts of justice if you don't have a childhood that predisposes you to that. It's only if the soul is properly prepared at a young age will you be able to reason about justice, okay? So recognizing justice requires being able to reason well about justice. But that requires being able to have the right taste for justice, the right attraction to it, and the right repelling from other things. So it's very complex. It's not just rational, like, this is just, I can see it with my brain. Your tastes, your spirit, and your mind are all aligned to wanting this thing that is just or that is not just, or they're misaligned. So in the end, the city expels everybody who is over a certain age, because they're not going to be able to be made into the type of paideia that is required for the city and speech to be just. And that's where we'll end for today. I just saw a question from Jean-Marc that Thumos, is Thumos spiritedness? Yes, Thumos is spiritedness. So as we keep going, spiritedness and Thumos are the same thing. And it's going to turn out that Thumos is a part of the soul, actually. So it's a characteristic. Like you'd say that person's thumotic, would be to say that person's spirited. But then also each person has a thumotic part of the soul, you'll find out. All right, so I actually have an appointment at 4 o'clock. I can take about 3 minutes of questions if anyone has any. No? Okay. So if no one has any, I'll let you go. And I'm just going to post this later for everyone else. Every once in a while, I'm going to do a live one of these instead of pre-recording it. And so I thank you for coming. Bye.
Feel better.
Thank you.
a
I
good day.
need it. You too.